about syntactic, we're thinking about the knowledge of the forms and structural relationships of written language. We're really talking about grammars, right? We've been enculturated into knowing what comes next, how a sentence should sound. And based upon this, we can make a hypothesis about what comes next. However, there is a difference between a grammar big G, and what makes us really excited as English people. Winston Churchill points it out perfectly. Ending a sentence with a preposition is something up with which I will not put. Grammatically correct. However, when we're thinking about language in use, discourse in use, normally it's ending a sentence with a preposition is something which I will not put up with. So we want to be careful that when we're talking about grammars, and when we visit this, we talk about some miscues. There's big G grammar, and there's grammar in use, dialect, discourse, those kinds of things that can impact how we're thinking about students and their use of this particular cueing system. So readers in this cueing system are concerned with a few different things. They want to ensure that words whose forms can be in agreement are in agreement. So for instance, she, cat are sitting. What could we mean by that sentence? What are the elements in this sentence? Which words go together? Cat sitting. Cat sitting. The cat is sitting, right? Whose cat is it?
She.
Oh, yeah. So this she isn't necessarily representing the cat. It's not denoting the cat as female. It's denoting ownership of the cat. So her cat, and her cat is sitting, right?
Oh, I thought the sentence was she is cat sitting. So there she is.
It's cat sitting. That worked too. So as we're thinking about those units, we're establishing meaningful relationships between words, making sure that they are in sync with one another. So her cat is sitting, or she is cat sitting, which is a slightly different, nice twist. I like it. So we also want to make sure that words are in the right order, right? And this is where we were talking about the Cambridge study and how you knew what would come next. If someone were to say, sitting her is cat, that doesn't necessarily make sense, right? We have to rearrange those because we have an understanding of how sentences are supposed to sound. So do some practice again. You're about to read a classic story. Have any of you read a Martin Geberter for Farfi before?
Yes.
Oh, good.
It's outstanding.
You are, yes, it's a lovely, lovely story. It's a classic. My Nona loved it. But what I would like you to do is read a Martin Geberter for Farfi. And at the end, there are 4 questions. So again, you're not just reading. I want you to be reading for understanding, reading for metacognition. How are you able to answer the questions? Thinking about, we're talking about syntax. How are you able to answer these questions? I'm going to check in about 4 minutes because you are a group of speed readers. After you're done reading, answer those 5 questions down below. I'm coming around to check. I heard that. Ooh, I can help with that. Okay.
You want to answer in
Okay. Check in.
Thank you.
Who knows what people are doing? Thank you. Quick pause in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If you could show me on your hand how many more minutes you would need to have a full effort, a full faith attempt at answering questions, that would be really helpful for me. How many more minutes do you need?
I chose it.
It just kept going. Kept going up. Okay. So let's take another 3.
We talk with our people needs. We have one type of kids. Just as presentation time. Everything is like this. Yeah. I think this is too. Right. This is
Done. Happy to be of service.
Maybe we could talk later.
It'll be great. Let's wait till the next one. It'll be like, oh, chapter 3 down. Sign off, please. 1 minute warning. Okay, hands in your space in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so let's tackle question number 1. Why was Gliss Frapper?
She had Denarpen Barfy's Marks in here.
Oh, and because she had Denarpen Farfy's Martin, what didn't she do?
She didn't tell the Geberter.
Oh, yes! Air high five. Oh, nicely done. How did you know?
I looked back.
So you didn't just look back in the text, you did something strategic.
Oh, I looked for those words in it.
Which words did you look for?
I looked, I don't know, whatever your question was.
Denarpen.
Yeah.
Or Frapper.
Frapper, yeah, I looked
Perhaps.
for that.
So you looked for Frapper. You indexed Frapper within the larger text. Based upon what we know about grammar, you were able to figure out that she had Denarpen Farfy's Martin, she had Geberter for him, followed, she was very Frapper, right? So that was a fairly easy question to answer. Let's move on to question number 2. What did Gliss plimp?
A Martin Binky.
A Martin Binky for who? For Farfy, right? How did we get that one?
Same way.
Same way. So we indexed,
Yep.
right? We looked for a word, and we were able to index that way. Who gibbled the gorger when Gliss sparved the binky? Wait, how did you know? This one's slightly more tricky. What did you have to do as a reader to figure it out?
Yeah, you had to do the pronoun thing, so you
Yeah.
saw the he, then you have to go back and find the answer.
Yes. So here you have an indirect pronoun, right? He, she, and you have to map who's the he and who's the she and the him. And once you map those things, that becomes an easier question to answer. But you have to map who the he is and who the she is. And for our English language learners, that's oftentimes really difficult. So as we're thinking about how these structures come into play, helping kids map out those relationships really explicitly is helpful. But yeah, you had to think through who's the he, who's the she in that opening paragraph and map those out. What did Farfy boff about the Martin Binky?
It's a cruise.
It's a cruise Martin Binky, right? How did you find that? How did you figure that answer out?
I'm gonna say that I looked for Bob and the Martin Binky, and where he balked about the Martin Binky, I went back and said, that's what he said about
Okay, so you just told me 2 things.
it. Okay.
That you looked for boff,
Yeah.
and you looked for boffed. Thinking about structural relationships, grammar relationships, how are those 2 things connected, boff and boffed? What did you have to know as a reader?
That it was the past tense of Bob.
That was a past tense, right? That was a derivation of boff. So even though boff doesn't appear in the story, we draw upon our knowledge of grammar in order to help us know that boffed refers to boff, and we can index that way. And last but not least, why didn't Gliss wank Farfy his Geberter?
So the stanza.
Oh, because what happens on Stanson?
Stanson is Martin is on Stanson.
Oh yeah, Farfy's Martin is on Stanson.
Yeah.
Air high five. Look at that. That was fluency right there. Bam. Nicely done. Great. And Egson is Kelson, right? It's not Stanson. It's Kelson. So there we had to look at those last 3 sentences, and go back and forth in order to establish those relationships between the various sentences. So you can see from this activity, we draw upon structure in really particular ways. And for some of our kiddos, this is how they blow through those accelerated reader tests. Some kids, this is how they read. For those of you who, as you were reading this, how many of you thought this doesn't make any sense? What is going on? Yeah, right. But yet, when we were able to be thinking about the grammar that underpinned the text, we were able to answer these questions. And so for a lot of our kids, they rely on that structure in order to make it through some of those questions. There are kids who read very much like this. So let's move on. We're going to be talking about semantics next. And when we're thinking about semantics, we're thinking about what sense is being made. And when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about words in relationship to one another, how they construct a sentence together, how sentences relate to one another, as well as the text as a whole. So it's a constant series of meaning making based upon these units. Now, in St. Louis, there's multiple ways to answer this particular question. So if I were to ask you here in Milwaukee, bears live in the shopping mall, arch, or forest, what would you say? Forest, right. However, a lot of the kiddos that I work with, we have a Cabela's and a Gander Mountain in our malls. And so a lot of them think bears live at the mall. Keep in mind, 6-year-olds. So I love that they think that bears can live in malls. I'm glad that they don't. They also, when we go to the Arch, there's the Museum of Westward Expansion, and that bear is right there to meet them. So when we're thinking about meaning, we want to be thinking about what is a kid's sense of the world? How do they come to understand it? Because it might not match ours, and so that might impact the sense that kids can make out of a text. For instance, in St. Louis City on our 3rd grade statewide assessment, St. Louis City kids repeatedly get the question about where are windmills in the country, in the city, in the ocean, and my kids, our 3rd graders in the city writ large, say the city, because we have Devo Mill. It's a local landmark. So their sense making of that is very much bound up in their world. And to try to get Desi to admit that it is a biased question is impossible. So we're going to move into another practice. And this one is the peddler and the tiger. And this is a cloze activity, C-L-O-Z-E. What I'm asking you to do is read the text. And as you come to blanks, I want you to think about what makes the most sense in those blanks. So these texts are on your tables, they're flipped over, so if you wouldn't mind distributing them. And of course you can work together, so if you want to talk through, that would be great. But we'll take about 5-ish minutes to work through this. And a quick side note, this was written by Brian Street, who is 1, Australian, and 2, very cheeky. He's a very funny man. So just keep that in mind as you're working through some of these spaces.
Yeah, because the person does right. Right. Yeah. There's no right. How we do this. The next sentence is he came had to drive You're right. You're right.
You're using that structural gene system.
How did more? Where's the tiger king? Oh, there was nothing but rain. Oh, it did. Oh, boy.
I mean, it doesn't sound perfect, but.
And yes, at last he came upon a drive.
I guess he's in the city. It's kind of the law.
She's like.
Yeah, yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
Why not? But what are we putting before that? Okay. It was not quite so asleep. It was not quite so cold or wet.
Yeah.
So we fell asleep.
Oh, good.
No
Came by.
hard and fast rule.
You know, I
Hardly see. The rain fell harder and faster. It was freezing cold and soaking wet.
another.
Oh, yep. But could not find one. But could find nothing or none, or nowhere, or do you keep it consistent with nowhere?
No.
Yeah, because we had nowhere up here. At last, we came to the old,
Like.
no, the wall against which the tiger lay asleep, right? Pepper saw the dim form of, oh, instead of angles?
Yeah.
Good, good. So what would this be? Pepper saw the dim form of blank. It has to start with a vowel.
Animal, an animal.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's right on me.
Oh, good, good. Tiger tried here and began to kick and hit. So he said, at last I found you. What did you run away for?
This must be mine or the,
He was very much surprised to
yeah,
have
right.
himself jump on his feet, or not on his jump, on his
Back.
back.
And
He said, get up now, I want to go home. Oh, yeah, we're there.
Wow.
15.
Okay. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So I want us to be thinking about, with this particular activity, were there any entries that were particularly difficult for you to think about? Which ones?
I think it was harder at the beginning than at the halfway point. Then it really went quickly.
Why do you think?
Because my peers were smart enough to notice the blanks that had to have a word that started with a vowel because of the and.
Okay.
So not looking at that carefully.
And so when we encountered that particular and, what ended up going in your space there?
Our first and came, at last the tiger came upon, and we originally had angled, but after we got to the end of the story, we went back and changed it to old based on the text that informed us that it was old.
Oh, so you had to go back.
Yep.
Right? As we're making meaning, we're always thinking through how the parts and text connect to each other. I'd like to draw your attention down to the peddler saw the dim form of an, this is the other an. What did we put there? Animal. Is there another word that has a higher semantic load based on what we know about the story thus far? Keeping in mind that Brian Street is a cheeky guy. What was the peddler looking for?
Ass.
Ass. Yes, an ass. So when we're thinking about semantics, we're thinking about meaning. We want to be thinking through that semantic load, right? What's a better match than something else? Tanya, is it okay if I'm 5 minutes over?
Absolutely. Go for it.
Okay. Sorry, I just looked at my watch and went, "Ooh." So normally I would go through this entire thing, but we have a time crunch. So those are the two big things I wanted you to attend to, the ways that you're using meaning as well as structure in order to be thinking through what makes sense in these spaces. So we're going to make a really quick jump back to graphophonics, semantics, and syntax as systems for kids to make hypotheses about reading. I'm going to skip our clickers because I want to make sure we have enough time to go over somewhat miscue analysis. So what a use of so using the linguistic cueing systems is a way for us to get into the processes that kids are using as they're hypothesizing about print. And that comes out in the miscue analysis. So I want to be thinking about how we can develop some culturally competent practices around this kind of assessment. So what I've just put on your table, there's a few different handouts that I've placed there in terms of time. One is a copy of a student's running record from a level J benchmark text called Grumpy Bear. The second is a miscue analysis tool chart. And the third is a table that outlines some selected linguistic patterns in African American vernacular English pulling from the literature. This does not include all of them and does not represent every single person in that particular community. But it is a nice place to start when we're thinking about how oral reading can look differently based upon the population with which we're working. So let's move into this analysis tool for a second, and I'll walk you through kind of briefly how this works. So when we're thinking about this miscue analysis, we're thinking about what the word in text is, right? Because we want to pull kids back to the clues that they're getting from the print. We want to hold them responsible for the print. We line it up with what the substitution is by the reader, and down below you'll notice there's a place for omissions and substitutions. We don't necessarily get as much information from them, so our analysis really focuses in on those substitutions. Now, when we're thinking about substitutions, we tend to be thinking through the visual, which is what system? Also known as graphophonic. Nicely done. Whether it's similar at the beginning, the middle, or the end. So for instance, worked, the substitution was walk. Very similar at the beginning. Right? So that's where my check mark is. That's where a kiddo is utilizing that particular linguistic cueing structure system. Same thing with grumbled. Grumbled, they're replacing it with grumbly. They're paying attention to the beginning and the middle. Same thing with himself. It's replaced with his self. Right? They're paying attention to the beginning and the end. So these are the visual commonalities. But we also have some structural, some grammatical commonalities. So for instance, fellow is replaced with guy in this particular running record, which means essentially the same thing and is supported by the structure of the text. If you look at that particular miscue in the running record, it makes sense. What a nice guy. What a nice fellow. Okay, so that noun is in the right place. Now, if you attend to the sheet that talks a little bit about some of the linguistic patterns that you can experience in a child who speaks the African American vernacular of English, there are some patterns here that, once again, do not apply to every child. When I'm thinking about working with my pre-service teachers, many of whom are white and female, and for whom this is their first time working with children who are different from them, I use this as a bit of a primer to get their ears ready for what they might hear, and to recognize that as a valid form of linguistic expression. Right? The most important thing that we can do in terms of thinking about a child's oral reading is to listen to their speech, to listen to their talk, and understand what registers they're bringing with them into our classroom, and how that could impact what's happening in a running record, an oral reading like this. So I want to focus in on what this running record is telling us right now. Just that analysis. In terms of just that analysis, there's 160 words. There's actually 164 total, but the name Felix was mentioned 5 times. Every time the child identified the same word for Felix, it was never an accurate reading. So I've gotten rid of 4 of those instances. Common practice. So that first one counts as a miscue. So that's where that 60 comes from. There's 21 total miscues overall. 18 of them are substitutions, 2 omissions, 1 addition, and 3 self-corrects. So 18 total miscues that go uncorrected. Now for a child, this means that they read this at an 88.75% accuracy, which means it's a frustrational level text for them. Meaning that when this child is possibly put into a small guided reading group, they're going to be put at a text that is lower than this particular text level. So let's take another look at this, thinking about what we know about linguistic patterns. And this is a running record pulled from one of my kids in my clinic. So this is an actual running record, and is a nice example of how this culturally competent teaching can to work. So you want to be thinking through how these lived grammars come into play, right? So as you're looking at these miscues, are there any miscues that strike you as a pattern?
The verbs.
Verbs.
The past tense verbs.
Yep, the past tense verbs. Once you start looking at the past tense verbs, you notice that the ED gets dropped. One of the things that is a linguistic phenomenon is that this is part of a lived grammar, part of African American vernacular English. So that means that we have to revisit structure and start thinking about how these things are supported by a lived grammar. Right? There's still deviations from print, yes, but in terms of the grammars that kiddos sometimes come to school with, it sounds correct. So once we've thought this through, once we've really delved into thinking through what we're seeing and how culturally are we representing kids' oral reading patterns, we have some new things that we now know. So this is all the same. So, but 7 of these miscues, 7 of them, align with established patterns that we know are associated with African American vernacular English. So 7 of them. So what this means, and this is where professional decision-making comes in, because that's a consistent pattern that I'm seeing across the running record, I'm pulling those miscues out, right? Another side note, this kiddo scored really well on comprehension. So when they were asked about questions within the story, outside of the story, we have a scale of 0 to 3, they had 3s and 2s on all of their questions. There's no way this should have been frustrational. So what's interesting is now that we've moved this, now that we've removed those things that are related to grammars, we now have a 93%. And this is an instructional text level for them. So by thinking through the patterns that we see and hear in the languages that kids bring to school and accounting for them in our assessments, we can turn miscue analysis into a culturally responsive assessment tool in order to be thinking about what strengths kids are bringing. This kid is obviously pulling a lot on structure, right? As well as thinking through sense making and then moving into areas for growth. So I had to rush through that last part. I'm really sorry, but hopefully we've had a chance to, as we're revisiting our content and process goals, think about those 3 linguistic cueing systems, analyze some oral reading to think about those linguistic cueing systems, and form an awareness of linguistic diversity, and how that shapes the way that we can think about kids in our reading. And hopefully you'll be able to tell me about the 3 linguistic cueing systems if I ask you randomly over the course of the next 8 hours. And understand the form and function of a miscue analysis. So, all of that said, thank you so much for your time. Sorry,
Thank you all, thank you all. And if you'd like to give any input to any of the committee members here, if you could raise your hands. These people are on the committee, the hiring committee, so feel free to chat. And we've got to run.
yes. So,
Thank you all.
thank you
Enjoy,
all
enjoy the rest of your day.
so much.
Stay dry.
No, I thought it's my office. Yeah.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, but it's gonna start snowing.
Let me just double check.
As usual.